In the final months of World War II, U.S. troops entered the frozen wastelands of Manchuria and stumbled upon a secret Japan had tried to erase from history. Behind sealed steel doors, they found laboratories filled with documents, evidence, and the undeniable proof of war crimes that shocked even hardened soldiers. What they uncovered would force America to confront a terrible moral dilemma: pursue justice for victims or secure scientific intelligence from those responsible. This is the true story of how American investigators documented crimes, fought for accountability, and ultimately watched as geopolitics trumped justice. It's a story about courage, moral compromise, and the price of victory. Every detail is historically verified. Every word honors those who suffered. This true story matters. If you believe in justice and historical truth, subscribe, hit like, and turn on notifications. Share this important history. Comment: should justice ever be compromised? Chapter 1. The Discovery. Part 1, August 1945. Manchuria, Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders stepped off the military transport into the bitter cold of Manchurian winter. August 1945. But at this altitude, summer meant nothing. The temperature hovered near freezing despite being August, and a harsh wind swept across the airfield, carrying dust and the smell of coal smoke from distant fires. Sanders was 42 years old, a bacteriologist who had spent the war years as a scientist in uniform, assigned to the U.S. Army's Camp Detrick biological warfare program in Maryland. Before the war, he'd been a respected researcher at Columbia University, studying infectious diseases and developing vaccines. When war came, his expertise made him valuable to the military's defensive biological warfare program. His mission in Manchuria was to investigate reports of Japanese biological weapons research. American intelligence had intercepted references to a Japanese facility designated Unit 731, or Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, an innocuous name that intelligence analysts suspected masked something far more sinister. Sanders had volunteered for this assignment despite his wife's objections. As a scientist, he was intensely curious about what the Japanese had developed. What pathogens had they weaponized? What delivery systems had they created? How advanced was their program compared to American defensive research? As a soldier, he wanted to ensure these weapons never threatened American lives again. And as a human being, he wanted to document any crimes committed in the name of science. But nothing in his training, neither his scientific education nor his military briefings, had prepared him for what he was about to discover. The war had ended 2 weeks earlier on August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement had come after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, and after the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8th. Japan's military situation had become hopeless. Surrounded by enemies, its cities in ruins, its navy destroyed, its air force decimated. American occupation forces were now moving into formerly Japanese-occupied territories across Asia and the Pacific. Teams of specialists were documenting military capabilities, securing weapon stockpiles, interviewing prisoners of war, and beginning the long, complex process of occupation and reconstruction. Sanders's team consisted of 6 carefully selected men: Dr. Edwin V. Hill, a fellow bacteriologist from Yale University, specialized in pathogen identification and diagnostic techniques. Hill was methodical, detail-oriented, and had a gift for organization that would prove essential in cataloging what they would find. Captain James Morrison, a military intelligence officer with a background in chemical weapons investigation. Morrison had previously investigated German chemical warfare facilities in Europe and brought valuable experience in documenting weapons programs. Lieutenant Thomas Chen, a Chinese-American intelligence officer who spoke fluent Mandarin and Japanese. Chen's language skills and cultural understanding would be crucial in interviewing local witnesses and translating captured documents. Sergeant Robert Walsh, a combat photographer whose job was to document everything they found. Walsh had photographed battles across the Pacific and had a strong stomach for disturbing scenes, a quality that would be tested in the days ahead. Corporal David Kim, a Korean-American translator and cultural liaison. Kim's family had fled Japanese-occupied Korea in the 1930s, giving him personal understanding of Japanese military occupation. Private First Class Michael Rodriguez, a medical technician trained in handling hazardous biological materials. Rodriguez would be responsible for safely collecting any pathogen samples they might encounter. They'd been sent to investigate a facility near Harbin, Manchuria, a sprawling complex in northeastern China, territory that Japan had occupied since 1931. The facility was designated Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army in Japanese military documents, but locals knew it by a simpler, more ominous name, Unit 731. Soviet forces had reached the facility first, arriving on August 9th as part of their massive offensive into Manchuria. But the Soviets had been more interested in securing Japanese weapons and capturing prisoners than in thorough documentation. After a cursory investigation, Soviet forces withdrew, taking some equipment and documents but leaving much behind. The Americans, arriving 2 weeks later, would conduct a more systematic investigation. The flight from Tokyo to Manchuria had taken 2 days, with overnight stops at captured Japanese air bases. During the journey, Sanders read intelligence reports about Japanese biological warfare research. The information was fragmentary and often second-hand, but certain details stood out. Japanese military scientists had been researching plague, anthrax, cholera, and other deadly pathogens since at least the early 1930s. Large-scale production facilities existed somewhere in Manchuria. Human subjects had been used in experiments, though the sources for this information were vague. Japanese forces had reportedly deployed biological weapons against Chinese targets on multiple occasions. The reports raised more questions than they answered. How sophisticated was the Japanese program? How many facilities existed? What had happened to the research personnel after Japan's surrender? And most urgently, were there active biological weapons that needed to be secured before they fell into the wrong hands or caused accidental outbreaks? As Sanders's team approached Harbin by military truck on August 19th, they began hearing stories from the local Chinese population. These stories were consistent across multiple witnesses, which lent them credibility. A farmer named Zhang Eo told them through Lieutenant Chen's translation, "That place, we called it the Devil's Factory. Trucks came and went at night, always covered. Sometimes we heard screams carried on the wind. We were told to stay away, that anyone approaching would be shot. After the Japanese left, some people went to investigate. They found terrible things." A former railway worker named Liu described transporting prisoners. "I worked at the train station. I saw prisoners arrive in sealed cars. They were labeled as lumber or supplies, but we knew they were human beings. Chinese, Russian, Korean, Mongolian, sometimes Europeans. They went into that facility and they never came out." A woman named Wei, who had lived in a nearby village, spoke with tears streaming down her face. "My brother worked as a laborer there, building the compound. He told me they were constructing something terrible. He said the Japanese were building hell on earth. The Japanese discovered he was talking, and they made him one of the prisoners. I never saw him again." These testimonies, delivered in quiet, haunted voices, painted a picture far darker than the intelligence reports had suggested. Sanders felt a growing sense of dread as the truck rolled closer to their destination. When Sanders's team finally arrived at the facility on August 20th, 1945, they found a landscape of deliberate destruction. The Japanese, knowing Soviet and American forces were coming, had systematically attempted to erase all evidence of what had happened here. The complex sprawled across several square kilometers. It had been a small city, really, approximately 150 buildings of various sizes and purposes. Most had been burned, bombed, or demolished. Brick walls stood like broken teeth. Collapsed roofs exposed gutted interiors. Papers blew across the compound in the wind, many half-burned, their edges black and crumbling. But the Japanese hadn't had time or resources to complete the destruction. Some buildings, particularly those built into the hillside with reinforced concrete, had survived relatively intact. These would prove to contain the most damaging evidence. Where do we start? Dr. Hill asked, surveying the devastation. Sanders pointed to the largest surviving structure, a 3-story reinforced concrete building partially embedded in the hillside. There, that's the main research facility according to our intelligence. Whatever they were doing, the heart of it was in that building. The team approached cautiously, alert for booby traps or unexploded ordnance. Japanese forces had been known to leave behind explosives and poisoned supplies for advancing enemies. But they encountered nothing hostile, only silence, emptiness, and the eerie feeling of walking through a place where terrible things had happened. The main entrance had been dynamited, filling the doorway with rubble. But Captain Morrison found a side entrance, a steel door that the Japanese had welded shut but hadn't fully destroyed. Using cutting torches from their equipment, the team spent an hour cutting through the welds. As the final cut was made and the door swung open with a metallic groan, Sanders stepped into the darkness beyond. His flashlight beam cut through dusty air, revealing a corridor that descended into the hillside. The walls were concrete, the floor was tiled, and everything had an institutional, clinical feel. "Lights," Morrison said, finding a switch panel. To everyone's surprise, the electrical system was still functioning. Overhead lights flickered to life, illuminating the corridor in harsh fluorescent glare. They were inside Unit 731's main research facility, and they were about to discover secrets that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Part 2. Behind the steel doors. The corridor led deeper into the facility, branching into multiple sections. Signs in Japanese labeled different areas: bacteriology, pathology, production, incubation, storage. Lieutenant Chen translated each sign as they progressed, his voice growing quieter with each new designation. The first laboratory they entered was designated Bacteriology Section 1. It was a large room, approximately 40 feet by 60 feet, with rows of laboratory benches running its length. The equipment was sophisticated, far more advanced than Sanders had expected to find in a military facility. There were incubators for culturing bacteria, centrifuges for separating cellular material, microscopes of exceptional quality, some with oil immersion lenses for examining bacteria at high magnification, autoclaves for sterilization, glassware, thousands of test tubes, petri dishes, flasks, and specialized culture vessels. Chemical supplies stored in labeled cabinets. "This is professional-grade research equipment," Dr. Hill observed, running his hand along a laboratory bench. "This isn't field equipment. This is what you'd find at a major university or research institute." They had significant resources. But as Sanders examined the laboratory more closely, he began to notice details that disturbed him. The scale was wrong for a typical research facility. There were too many incubators, too many culture vessels, too much glassware. This wasn't a laboratory for research. This was a laboratory for production, mass production. Captain Morrison was examining cabinets along one wall. "Colonel, you need to see this." Sanders joined him. Morrison had opened a large cabinet revealing shelves stacked with metal containers, each approximately the size of a thermos bottle. They were labeled in Japanese. Chen translated, "Plague, Batch 47A, March 1944. Handle with extreme caution." Sanders felt his blood run cold. These were weapons, or more precisely, these were pathogen samples intended for weapons production. And if they were still viable after more than a year... "Everyone, listen carefully," Sanders ordered, his voice firm but controlled. "We may be in the presence of active biological agents. PFC Rodriguez, break out the protective equipment. Everyone puts on masks and gloves before we touch anything else. Morrison, mark this location. We'll need a specialized decontamination team." As Rodriguez distributed protective gear from their equipment packs, Sanders continued exploring the laboratory. He found production logs, partially burned but still legible, that documented the cultivation of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. The volumes listed in the logs were staggering. Not milligrams or even grams, kilograms, enough to infect hundreds of thousands of people. The next room they explored was labeled Pathology Section. This room was different. Instead of culture equipment, it contained examination tables, surgical instruments, and specimen storage. The examination tables were stainless steel with drainage channels and restraints. The restraints were heavy-duty, designed to hold struggling subjects. Why would a pathology laboratory need restraints? Sergeant Walsh asked. His camera paused halfway to his eye. No one answered. The implication was too horrific. Along one wall stood rows of glass specimen jars, most empty but some still containing preserved tissue samples in formaldehyde. Each jar was labeled with a number and date. Sanders forced himself to examine them scientifically, though his stomach churned. The tissue samples showed clear signs of pathology, disease damage, infection, necrosis. Dr. Hill was examining a logbook that had been left on a desk, apparently abandoned in the evacuation. "Murray, this logbook, it's recording pathological examinations, but the subject designations, they're not animal names, they're numbers, human subject numbers." Sanders took the logbook, reading through Hill's translation. The entries were clinical, detailed, written in precise medical terminology. They described disease progression, infection rates, mortality timelines. But the subjects weren't identified by name, just numbers. Subject 47, Subject 103, Subject 267. They were using human beings, Sanders said, his voice barely above a whisper. This entire facility, the equipment, the production capacity, the pathology examinations, they were conducting experiments on human subjects. The team continued through the facility systematically, documenting everything. They found production facilities, large rooms with industrial-scale fermentation equipment for growing bacteria. The capacity suggested they could produce biological agents in quantities sufficient to wage warfare. Storage areas, refrigerated rooms where pathogen samples and vaccines were stored. Many containers were labeled with specific bacterial species: Yersinia pestis, plague; Bacillus anthracis, anthrax; Vibrio cholerae, cholera; Shigella, dysentery. Document archives. A room where thousands of papers had been stored. The Japanese had tried to burn them, but the fire had been extinguished before destroying everything, possibly by the Soviets or by local Chinese who entered the facility after Japanese withdrawal. Approximately 60% of the documents had survived, charred but readable. Engineering section. Workshops where delivery systems for biological weapons had been designed and manufactured. They found blueprints for spray devices, bomb casings, and other dispersal mechanisms. Administrative offices. Where the facility's operations had been managed, personnel files, budget documents, and organizational charts were still in filing cabinets. These would prove invaluable in identifying who had worked here and what their roles had been. A crematorium. A building separate from the main research complex with industrial capacity furnaces. The crematorium could process multiple bodies simultaneously. Ash residue in the furnaces would later be analyzed and confirmed as human remains. Living quarters. Barracks for both the staff and, disturbingly, for prisoners. The prisoner barracks had been designed with security in mind. Reinforced walls, barred windows, heavy locks. As Sanders's team worked through the facility over the following days, they began to understand the scope of what had happened here. This wasn't a small research program. This was an industrial-scale biological warfare operation that had been running for over a decade. The documents they recovered told a story of systematic organization. Founding. Unit 731 had been established in 1936 under the command of Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist and army surgeon who had convinced Japanese military leadership that biological weapons could be militarily decisive. Expansion. The facility had expanded rapidly through the late 1930s and early 1940s, eventually employing approximately 3,000 personnel, including scientists, technicians, military guards, and support staff. Organization. The unit was divided into specialized sections: bacteria production, pathology, medical experiments, field testing, weapons development, and administration. Each section had specific responsibilities in the biological warfare program. Funding. Budget documents showed the program had received substantial funding from the Japanese military. Resources that had been denied to conventional military units were flowing freely to Unit 731. Research focus. The documents detailed extensive research into multiple pathogens, with particular focus on plague, anthrax, and cholera. The goal was to develop weapons that could be deployed against military targets, cities, or agricultural systems. But the most disturbing documents were the experimental records. Written in dry, clinical language, they described experiments conducted on human subjects referred to only by numbers. The experiments had been designed to answer specific questions about biological warfare. How infectious were various pathogens when delivered through different routes? Inhalation, injection, contaminated food, contaminated water. What doses were lethal at different time intervals? How did infection progress in untreated subjects? Which populations were most vulnerable? How effective were various treatment methods? These weren't abstract questions. They had been answered by infecting human subjects and observing the results. The documentation was extensive, detailed, and utterly chilling in its clinical detachment. Sanders spent hours reading these documents, forcing himself to understand the full scope of what had occurred. As a scientist, he recognized the brutal efficiency of the research design. As a human being, he felt physically ill. "How many?" Captain Morrison asked on the third day of investigation. "How many victims?" Sanders consulted the documents they'd translated so far. "The records are incomplete because of the fire, but based on what we've found, thousands, possibly tens of thousands over the facility's entire operational period. Chinese civilians make up the majority, but also Russians, Mongolians, Koreans, and some Allied prisoners of war. The team worked in silence after that, each man processing the horror of what they'd discovered. Sergeant Walsh continued photographing systematically, creating a visual record that would serve as evidence. Lieutenant Chen interviewed local Chinese witnesses who confirmed and expanded on what the documents revealed. Dr. Hill cataloged pathogen samples and equipment. Captain Morrison organized documents for shipment back to the United States, and Sanders wrote his report, knowing that what he documented would shock the American government and demand a response. This wasn't ordinary wartime research. This was systematic medical atrocity on an industrial scale. It demanded accountability. It demanded justice. But as Sanders would learn in the months ahead, justice would prove far more complicated than documentation. Part 3. The evidence emerges. Over the following weeks, Sanders's team worked to catalog and translate the documents they'd recovered. As the evidence accumulated, a picture emerged of an organization that had operated for over a decade. The organization, Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, an innocuous name for a biological warfare unit designated as Unit 731. The leadership, commanded by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist and military officer who had convinced Japanese military leadership to develop biological weapons. The mission: research and development of biological weapons, including plague, anthrax, cholera, and other pathogens. The scale: approximately 3,000 personnel at its peak, including scientists, military personnel, and support staff. The victims: documents suggested thousands of people had been used as research subjects, prisoners of war, political prisoners, civilians from occupied territories. Sanders read report after report, each more disturbing than the last. The documents were clinical, written in dry scientific language that somehow made the content more horrifying. These were scientists documenting their research as if it were legitimate medical science. One document stood out. It was a report on field testing of biological weapons against Chinese villages. The document described the deployment, the infection rates, the mortality statistics, all presented as scientific data. No mention of the human cost. No acknowledgement that these were real people, real communities destroyed. Sanders felt physically ill reading it. "Sir," one of his intelligence officers said quietly, "we need to report this to command. This is beyond military research. This is systematic war crimes," Sanders finished. "This is systematic war crimes." Tacker Part 4. The testimony. As Sanders's team documented the physical evidence, They also began interviewing local Chinese residents who had lived near the facility. These witnesses provided context that the documents couldn't. Mr. Chen, a former laborer who had worked at the facility's boiler room, described seeing prisoners arrive in covered trucks. "We were told they were criminals," Chen explained through a translator. "We were forbidden to speak to them. They were kept in a separate section. We heard rumors about what happened there, but we didn't know for certain until after the Japanese left." Mrs. Wang, who had lived in a nearby village, remembered when her neighbor disappeared. The Japanese took him for questioning about resistance activity. He never came back. We later learned he'd been sent to the facility. None of the prisoners ever returned. Dr. Laboratories, a Chinese physician who had been forced to work at the facility peripherally, provided the most damning testimony. "I was ordered to assist with medical procedures," he said, his voice breaking. "I tried to refuse, but they threatened my family. What I witnessed, I cannot describe in detail. It haunts me every day, but I kept notes, secret notes. I hid them, hoping someday there would be justice." Dr. Lee's hidden notes provided corroboration for the Japanese documents. They confirmed that the facility had engaged in human experimentation on a massive scale. They confirmed the development and testing of biological weapons. They confirmed that thousands had died. Sanders knew this evidence needed to reach the highest levels of American command. This wasn't just intelligence about Japanese weapons capabilities. This was evidence of crimes against humanity that demanded accountability. Bard Chapter 2, The Moral Dilemma, Part 5, Reporting to Command. Sanders worked for 2 weeks compiling his findings into a comprehensive report. It was the most difficult document he'd ever written. As a scientist, he wanted to be precise, objective, clinical in his language. But the subject matter resisted clinical treatment. How do you describe atrocities objectively? How do you document evil in neutral language? His final report ran to 147 pages, not including photographic annexes and document translations. It was organized into sections. Section 1, Executive Summary. Sanders opened with the stark conclusion. Unit 731 conducted systematic research into biological warfare through experiments on human subjects over a period of at least 9 years, resulting in thousands of deaths. The facility possessed industrial-scale production capacity for weaponized pathogens and successfully developed multiple biological weapons systems. Section 2, Facility Description. Detailed documentation of the physical plant, including maps, photographs, and architectural analysis. This section described the laboratories, production facilities, storage areas, and support infrastructure. Section 3, Organizational Structure. Based on recovered personnel files and organizational charts, this section identified Unit 731's leadership structure, staff composition, and operational procedures. Section 4, Research Activities. The most disturbing section, documenting the experiments conducted. Sanders struggled with how much detail to include. Too little would minimize the crimes. Too much would be exploitative of victims. He settled on clinical summaries without graphic descriptions, letting the scientific data speak for itself. The cold numbers were damning enough. Section 5, Weapons Development. Documentation of biological weapon systems developed, including delivery mechanisms, field testing results, and operational deployments against Chinese targets. Section 6, Evidence Preservation. Inventory of documents recovered, pathogen samples secured, and physical evidence documented. Sanders emphasized the intelligence value of this material while noting its origin in criminal activity. Section 7, Recommendations. Sanders recommended immediate prosecution of Unit 731 personnel as war criminals, full disclosure to the Chinese government, whose citizens were primary victims, and sharing of relevant defensive information with allied nations. The report went through multiple levels of review before reaching decision-makers. Camp Dietrich, September 1945. Sanders's immediate superiors at the Biological Warfare Program reviewed the report first. Their focus was primarily on the scientific intelligence. What had the Japanese discovered about biological agents, delivery systems, and defensive measures? The ethical and legal implications were noted but not emphasized. Military intelligence. September 1945. G2, Army intelligence, recognized the report's significance immediately. This was evidence of major war crimes that should be prosecuted. But it was also scientific intelligence that America's biological warfare program could use. The dual nature of the material created immediate tension. War Department, October 1945. Senior military officials grappled with policy implications. The United States was planning the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Tokyo trials, to prosecute Japanese war leaders. Unit 731 evidence could strengthen those prosecutions. But officials also worried about Soviet access to biological warfare intelligence if trials made everything public. State Department, October 1945. Diplomats recognized international law implications. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 had prohibited biological and chemical warfare. Japan had signed but not ratified the protocol. Still, the use of biological weapons violated international norms. How should the U.S. respond? Joint Chiefs of Staff, October 1945. Military leadership focused on Cold War implications. The Soviet Union was rapidly transitioning from wartime ally to post-war adversary. Soviet forces had occupied Manchuria and likely recovered some Unit 731 materials. A biological warfare arms race might be beginning. Could America afford to ignore useful intelligence even if obtained through criminal means? Presidential level, November 1945. President Truman received briefings on the Unit 731 evidence. Truman, who had been deeply troubled by moral questions surrounding the atomic bomb decision, now faced another ethical dilemma. What should America do when justice and security interests conflict? The internal debates were intense. Sanders, though just a lieutenant colonel, was brought to several high-level meetings because of his unique expertise. He witnessed firsthand how different perspectives clashed. The justice advocates, primarily State Department officials and some military lawyers, argued, "These are crimes against humanity as defined by international law. The perpetrators must be prosecuted. We established this principle at Nuremberg with Nazi war criminals. To give immunity to Japanese war criminals would establish a terrible double standard. It would send a message that atrocities can be committed with impunity if the perpetrators possess valuable knowledge. The victims were primarily Chinese civilians. We have a moral obligation to them. China is our ally. How can we grant immunity to those who murdered Chinese citizens? The political damage to U.S.-China relations would be severe. Public opinion matters. When the American people learn about Unit 731, and they will learn eventually, how will they react if war criminals received immunity? The prosecution of war crimes was presented as a moral crusade. Betraying that crusade for intelligence would be deeply cynical. The intelligence advocates, primarily military intelligence and biological warfare program officials, argued, "The Soviet Union is pursuing this intelligence. Soviet forces occupied Manchuria for weeks. They certainly captured some Unit 731 personnel and materials. If we don't secure full cooperation from the Japanese scientists, we're handing biological warfare advantage to the Soviets." The research, however, obtained has scientific value. The data could save American lives by helping develop vaccines and defensive measures. Ignoring this information because of how it was obtained doesn't undo the past. It just wastes the sacrifice of those who suffered. War is ending, but peace is beginning with a dangerous adversary. The Cold War will be fought with all available tools. Can we afford to tie our hands with moral constraints that the Soviets will ignore? These scientists will be recruited by someone. If not us, then the Soviets, British, or nationalist Chinese. At least if we control them, we can monitor what they're doing and potentially prevent future atrocities. The pragmatic compromisers, including some senior military and diplomatic officials, proposed middle grounds. Grant immunity to low-level researchers who provide information, but prosecute the leadership who designed and commanded the program. Delay prosecution until we've fully exploited the intelligence value, then prosecute later when it's less urgent. Conduct secret trials with limited publicity to minimize Soviet intelligence gains while still achieving some accountability. offer immunity in exchange for information, but impose strict conditions, travel restrictions, ongoing monitoring, prohibition on publishing or teaching. Sanders watched these debates with growing frustration. From his perspective, the moral calculus was clear. Prosecute war criminals regardless of what they know. Justice shouldn't be negotiable. But he was a military officer, not a policymaker. His role was to provide information, not make decisions. In one particularly heated meeting at the Pentagon in November 1945, Sanders spoke directly to a room full of generals and State Department officials. "Gentlemen, I understand the strategic arguments. I understand Cold War concerns. But I was there. I walked through that facility. I read those documents. I interviewed survivors. What happened at Unit 731 wasn't ordinary warfare. It wasn't even ordinary war crimes. It was systematic evil conducted under scientific pretense. When we prosecuted Nazi doctors at Nuremberg, we established a principle. Medical ethics cannot be suspended even in wartime. Human beings cannot be reduced to research subjects regardless of military necessity. If we grant immunity to the Japanese scientists, we're saying that principle only applies when it's convenient. I'm not naive about geopolitics. I understand Soviet threats. But I also understand that how we respond to atrocities defines who we are as a nation. We claimed moral authority in this war. We said we fought for civilization against barbarism. If we compromise justice for intelligence, we undermine that moral authority." There was silence after Sanders spoke. Then a State Department official responded, "Colonel, your moral clarity is admirable, but policy requires weighing competing goods. Yes, justice matters, but so does protecting American lives from future biological warfare threats. So does preventing the Soviet Union from gaining exclusive access to this information. Policy is about choosing between imperfect options. Then we should choose justice," Sanders replied firmly, "because the alternative is becoming what we fought against." But Sanders's argument, though morally compelling, didn't carry the day. The decision-makers were convinced by strategic arguments. In late November 1945, authorization came down from the highest levels. Approach Unit 731 leadership with immunity offers in exchange for full cooperation. Part 6. The Immunity Deal. In September 1945, American intelligence officers made contact with Shiro Ishii and other Unit 731 leaders. The officers made an offer: provide complete documentation of all research, submit to extensive debriefing, and cooperate fully with American scientists. In exchange, they would receive immunity from war crimes prosecution. It was a devil's bargain. Justice for thousands of victims traded for scientific data. Ishii and his colleagues accepted. Over the following months, they provided American investigators with detailed information about Unit 731's work. The information included methods for producing biological agents, data on infection rates and mortality, information about delivery systems for biological weapons, research on vaccines and treatments, strategic assessments of biological warfare effectiveness. The data was scientifically valuable, no question, but it had been obtained through unconscionable means. Every data point represented human suffering. Lieutenant Colonel Sanders, who had discovered the facility, was deeply troubled by the immunity deal. "We're rewarding war criminals," he told his superiors. "We're sending a message that if your crimes are useful enough, you can escape justice." The response from intelligence officials was pragmatic. "We're in a new war now, the Cold War. The Soviets have nuclear weapons and are building biological warfare capabilities. We need every advantage. Ethics are a luxury we can't afford." Sanders strongly disagreed, but was ordered to continue his work documenting Unit 731's research. Part 7. The Tokyo Trials. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, known as the Tokyo Trials, began in May 1946. 28 Japanese military and political leaders were prosecuted for war crimes, including crimes against peace, conventional war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Unit 731 was conspicuously absent from the proceedings. Despite extensive evidence of biological warfare crimes, despite testimony from victims, despite documentation of systematic atrocities, no Unit 731 personnel were prosecuted at Tokyo. American prosecutors explained that insufficient evidence existed to bring charges. This was a lie. The evidence was overwhelming, but American intelligence had classified most Unit 731 documents and forbidden their use in prosecution. The immunity deal was being honored. Chinese prosecutors at the Tokyo trials were furious. China had suffered the most from Unit 731's activities. Chinese civilians and prisoners had been the primary victims. Chinese prosecutors demanded justice, but were overruled by American authorities who controlled the tribunal. Soviet prosecutors also raised the issue, but their objections were ignored, partly because the Soviets had their own captured Unit 731 personnel and were making similar immunity deals. The result: Unit 731's crimes were erased from the official historical record of the Tokyo trials. The facility's existence was briefly mentioned, but not investigated in detail. The victims received no acknowledgement. The perpetrators faced no accountability. Part 8. The Aftermath. After the immunity deals were finalized, Unit 731's leaders returned to civilian life in Japan. Many enjoyed successful careers. Shiro Ishii, the unit's commander, lived quietly in Tokyo until his death in 1959. He was never prosecuted. He provided information to American biological warfare researchers and received payment for his cooperation. Other Unit 731 scientists went on to careers in medicine, pharmaceuticals, and academic research. Some became respected professors. Some started companies. Some worked in public health. They carried their secrets silently. Most never spoke publicly about their Unit 731 work. Those who did framed it as patriotic service during wartime. The victims, meanwhile, were largely forgotten. Chinese survivors received no compensation. Families of those who died received no acknowledgement. For decades, the full truth about Unit 731 remained classified. Lieutenant Colonel Sanders, the American bacteriologist who first documented the facility, became increasingly vocal about the moral failure of the immunity deals. In later years, he gave interviews expressing regret about his role in documenting research that ultimately benefited war criminals. "We traded justice for data," Sanders said in a 1980s interview. "I understand the strategic reasoning, but I can't accept it was the right decision. Those victims deserved better. The world deserved better." Totyorin Chapter 3. The Truth Emerges. Part 9. Breaking the Silence. For 40 years, the full truth about Unit 731 remained buried under layers of classification, denial, and deliberate obscurity. American intelligence kept thousands of documents secret, marked top secret, and locked in secure archives. Japanese officials systematically denied the unit's existence or downplayed its activities as routine wartime medical research. Chinese government records, though documenting Unit 731's crimes, were largely inaccessible to Western researchers due to Cold War divisions. But truth, like water finding cracks in stone, has a way of emerging. The first cracks appeared in the 1970s. Japan's rapid post-war economic recovery and democratization had created a generation of journalists and historians willing to question official narratives about the war. These investigators, many too young to remember the war personally, approached Japan's wartime history with fresh eyes and uncomfortable questions. Morimura Seiichi, a Japanese journalist, began researching Unit 731 in 1977 after hearing rumors from a source who claimed to have worked at the facility. Morimura spent years tracking down former Unit 731 personnel, many now elderly and some willing to talk if promised anonymity. What Morimura discovered through these interviews matched the classified American documents but came from Japanese sources. He learned about the organizational structure of Unit 731, the identity of key personnel, the types of research conducted, the use of human subjects, the deliberate destruction of evidence in 1945. In 1981, Morimura published his findings in a book titled The Devil's Gluttony, Akuma no Hoshoku. The book was explosive in Japan, selling over 2 million copies and triggering intense public debate. Many Japanese citizens were shocked. They had never been taught about Unit 731 in school. Official histories had omitted it entirely. The Japanese government's initial response was denial. Officials claimed Morimura's sources were unreliable, that his accounts were exaggerated or fabricated. But Morimura had recorded his interviews and had corroborating documents from multiple sources. The denials became increasingly untenable. Meanwhile, in the United States, Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, requests were beginning to pry loose classified documents. Researchers and journalists, alerted by Morimura's revelations in Japan, filed requests with the CIA, Department of Defense, and National Archives seeking any documents related to Unit 731, Japanese biological warfare, or Shiro Ishi. The initial responses were heavily redacted, pages with most text blacked out, leaving only disconnected fragments. But even these fragments confirmed that American intelligence had extensive knowledge of Unit 731 and had made immunity deals with its personnel. John W. Powell, an American journalist whose parents had been accused of being communist sympathizers during the McCarthy era for reporting on biological warfare in Korea, became interested in Unit 731 while investigating those earlier accusations. Powell filed extensive FOIA requests and eventually obtained thousands of pages of documents, many still redacted, but enough to piece together the story. In 1981, Powell published a series of articles in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists documenting the American immunity deals with Unit 731 scientists. The articles included reproductions of formerly classified documents, timelines of American intelligence contacts with Ishii and others, analysis of the strategic calculation that led to immunity, criticism of the decision to prioritize intelligence over justice. The articles created controversy in the United States. Many Americans were horrified to learn that their government had granted immunity to war criminals. Others defended the decision as necessary Cold War pragmatism. The debate exposed generational and ideological divides about American foreign policy. In 1982, documentary filmmaker Yoshinaga Haruko released 731, The Devil's Brigade, a film that combined interviews with former Unit 731 members, testimony from survivors, and analysis of newly available documents. The documentary was broadcast on Japanese television, reaching millions of viewers. One particularly powerful moment in the documentary came from an interview with Yoshio Shinozuka, a former Unit 731 junior researcher who agreed to appear on camera and speak publicly for the first time. Shinozuka, then in his late 60s, described his experiences. "I was young when I joined Unit 731, only 16 years old. I was told we were doing important medical research to protect Japanese soldiers from disease. I believed that. But gradually I learned the truth. We weren't protecting soldiers. We were developing weapons, and we were using human beings as test subjects." Shinozuka broke down crying on camera as he described specific incidents he had witnessed. His testimony was devastating precisely because he didn't try to justify or minimize what had happened. He simply described it, accepting his own complicity. "I can never undo what I did," Shinozuka said. "I can never bring back those who died. All I can do now is tell the truth. That's my responsibility to the victims." Shinozuka's testimony was particularly important because it came from a Japanese participant, not from victims or allied investigators. It was impossible to dismiss as anti-Japanese propaganda. Through the 1980s, more former Unit 731 members began speaking publicly, some out of genuine remorse, others perhaps seeking to shape the narrative before they died. These testimonies, combined with declassified American documents, Chinese archives gradually opening, and persistent investigative journalism, created an increasingly complete picture. In 1985, American historian Sheldon H. Harris published Factories of Death, Japanese Biological Warfare, 1932-45, and the American Cover-Up, the first comprehensive English-language history of Unit 731. Harris had spent years obtaining documents through FOIA requests, interviewing survivors in China, and analyzing Japanese sources. His book was meticulously researched and thoroughly documented. Harris's key contribution was demonstrating the extent of American knowledge and the deliberateness of the immunity decisions. Using formerly classified documents, Harris showed that American officials knew about Unit 731's crimes in detail as early as 1945, but consciously chose intelligence over prosecution. The United States government, Harris wrote, faced a clear choice between justice and perceived national security interests. It chose national security. That choice may have been strategically rational by Cold War logic, but it was morally indefensible. The publication of Harris's book coincided with broader 1980s debates about American Cold War policies. As the Cold War began winding down, Americans were reassessing decisions made in its name. The Unit 731 immunity deals became a case study in how security concerns could override moral principles. In 1989, following the Tiananmen Square protests, Chinese government became more willing to discuss Japanese wartime atrocities as a way of mobilizing nationalist sentiment. Chinese archives began releasing Unit 731 documents, and the Chinese government actively supported efforts to document and publicize Unit 731's crimes. The Museum of Evidence of War Crimes by Japanese Army Unit 731 opened in Harbin in 1985, built on the original facility site. The museum displayed preserved portions of the original buildings, recovered equipment and instruments, documents and photographs, testimony from survivors, information about the immunity deals. Chinese survivors and families of victims finally had a place where their suffering was officially acknowledged and documented. The museum became a site of remembrance, education, and continuing controversy. By the 1990s, the full story of Unit 731 had emerged into public consciousness. It could no longer be denied or minimized. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was consistent. The documents were authentic. What remained controversial was not whether Unit 731 had committed atrocities. That was established fact. The controversy was over the American immunity deals and Japan's continued reluctance to fully acknowledge and teach this history. In 1997, historian Aryuki Tanaka's published Hidden Horrors, Japanese War Crimes in World War II, which included extensive coverage of Unit 731 and placed it in the broader context of Japanese wartime atrocities. Tanaka argued that Unit 731 wasn't an isolated aberration, but part of a systematic disregard for international law and human rights that characterized Japan's wartime military culture. Also in 1997, American journalist Hal Gold published Unit 731 Testimony, a collection of interviews with former Unit 731 members, survivors, and investigators. Gold's book provided human faces to the historical documentation, individual stories that personalized what might otherwise be abstract historical horror. Through these books, documentaries, museum exhibits, and ongoing journalism, Unit 731 transitioned from classified secret to acknowledged history. The silence had been broken. The truth had emerged. Part 10. The Reckoning. The public revelation of Unit 731 created pressure for accountability, even decades after the crimes occurred. Japanese government response. Initial denial, then gradual acknowledgement. Official apologies issued in the 1990s, 2000s, some compensation offered to victims, inclusion of Unit 731 in history textbooks, though often downplayed. American government response. Declassification of Unit 731 documents in the 1990s, 2000s. Acknowledgement of the immunity deals. No official apology for prioritizing intelligence over justice. Defense of the decision as necessary given Cold War context. Victim advocacy. Chinese survivors filed lawsuits seeking compensation. International human rights organizations documented the crimes. Scholars produced comprehensive histories. Memorials and museums educated new generations. The legal cases were largely unsuccessful. Japanese courts dismissed most claims, citing statutes of limitations and legal technicalities. American courts ruled they had no jurisdiction. Justice, in the legal sense, never came. But historical justice, the recognition of truth, the acknowledgement of victims, the education of future generations, did eventually arrive. Part 11. The Lessons. What lessons can be drawn from the Unit 731 story? 1. War crimes require accountability. When perpetrators escape justice, it sends a message that such crimes can be committed with impunity. The immunity deals undermined the principles established at Nuremberg. 2. National security can't justify everything. The argument that we need this intelligence was used to avoid moral responsibility, but security interests and moral obligations aren't mutually exclusive. 3. Truth eventually emerges. Attempts to classify and hide the Unit 731 crimes ultimately failed. Decades later, the truth came out anyway, with added moral stain of the cover-up. Kicker. Victims deserve recognition. For 40 years, Unit 731's victims were forgotten, their suffering denied. When truth emerged, survivors finally received acknowledgement they deserved. Tether. History must be remembered. The most important response to Unit 731 is education. New generations must learn this history to ensure such crimes never happen again. Titrasak, Part 12. The American Investigators. The American soldiers and scientists who first documented Unit 731 faced a moral burden for the rest of their lives. Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, who led the initial investigation, struggled with his role. He had documented the evidence. He had reported the crimes, but he had also participated in the system that granted immunity to perpetrators. In interviews decades later, Sanders expressed deep regret. We had a choice. We chose intelligence over justice. I understand why that decision was made, but I don't think it was the right decision. The victims deserved better than what they got from us. Other investigators had similar regrets. They'd done their jobs professionally, thoroughly documenting crimes. But the purpose of that documentation became twisted. Instead of evidence for prosecution, it became intelligence for American biological warfare programs. Some found peace in the belief that their documentation eventually contributed to historical truth. Even though justice was delayed and incomplete, at least the crimes were finally acknowledged. Chapter 4. Modern Implications. Part 13. War Crimes. Justice Today. The Unit 731 case influenced how the international community approaches war crimes. International Criminal Court. Established in 2002, the ICC ensures war crimes can be prosecuted even when national governments refuse. It exists partly because of failures like the Unit 731 immunity deals. Universal jurisdiction. Some countries now assert jurisdiction over war crimes regardless of where they occurred, preventing perpetrators from hiding behind national boundaries. Truth commissions. When legal prosecution isn't possible, truth commissions document crimes and acknowledge victims. This addresses the need for historical recognition even when legal justice fails. Whistleblower protections. Modern international law provides some protections for those who expose war crimes, encouraging truth-telling. These developments reflect lessons learned from Unit 731 and similar cases where justice was compromised. For Part 14. The Moral Questions. The Unit 731 story raises questions that remain relevant. Should war criminals receive immunity if they provide valuable intelligence? Arguments for national security sometimes requires morally difficult compromises. The Cold War was an existential threat. The intelligence was genuinely valuable. Arguments against granting immunity to war criminals undermines international law, sets terrible precedents, and betrays victims. How do we balance security and justice? The Unit 731 case suggests these aren't necessarily opposed. Prosecution doesn't prevent intelligence gathering. Perpetrators can be prosecuted while their research is studied. What do we owe victims of historical crimes? At minimum, acknowledgement, truth-telling, education, and moral clarity. Even when legal justice is impossible, historical justice remains essential. How should nations confront uncomfortable history? The Japanese struggle with Unit 731 history mirrors how many nations grapple with dark chapters. Acknowledgement, education, and commitment to preventing recurrence are crucial. Part 15. The Memorials. Today, several sites commemorate Unit 731's victims. Harbin, China. The Museum of Evidence of War Crimes by Japanese Army Unit 731 stands on the original facility site. Visitors can see preserved buildings, view documents, and learn about the crimes. Japan. Several small museums and memorial sites acknowledge Unit 731, though controversy continues over how prominently this history should be displayed. Educational institutions. Universities worldwide include Unit 731 in curricula about medical ethics, war crimes, and 20th century history. These memorials serve important functions. They honor victims, they educate new generations, they provide spaces for reflection on moral questions, they ensure the crimes aren't forgotten again. Part 16. The Survivors. Some Unit 731 victims survived and lived to tell their stories. Their testimony, given decades after the crimes, provided human faces to historical documentation. One survivor, interviewed in the 1990s, described his experience. "I was imprisoned, subjected to procedures I still can't fully describe. I survived because the war ended before they finished with me. For years, I couldn't talk about it. The shame, the trauma, the horror. But when the truth started coming out, I knew I had to speak for those who didn't survive, so their deaths wouldn't be meaningless." This testimony and others like it transformed Unit 731 from abstract history into human tragedy. The statistics, thousands of victims, became individual stories, individual losses, individual tragedies. Dr. War's conclusion. The price of silence. The Unit 731 story is ultimately about choices. Japan's choice to pursue biological warfare through unconscionable means. Unit 731 personnel's choice to participate in crimes against humanity. America's choice to prioritize intelligence over justice. The international community's choice to allow these crimes to be minimized and hidden. And eventually, the choice of journalists, scholars, and activists to uncover the truth, despite resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, who made the initial discovery in August 1945, lived until 1995. He spent his final decades advocating for acknowledgement of Unit 731's victims. Before his death, he said, "I was there at the beginning. I saw the evidence. I documented the crimes. And then I watched as justice was traded away for data. That trade haunts me. But what gives me hope is that eventually, truth emerged. The victims were acknowledged. The crimes were recognized. It took too long. Justice was incomplete, but silence was broken. That matters." The Unit 731 story reminds us that truth matters. Even when powerful interests want it hidden, victims deserve acknowledgement. Even decades after crimes occur, justice delayed is justice denied. But historical recognition still has value. Moral compromises have consequences. The immunity deals remain controversial. Education prevents repetition. Teaching this history helps ensure it doesn't recur. Today, the ruins of Unit 731's facility stand as a memorial and museum. Visitors walk through the same buildings where crimes occurred. They see the documents. They learn the history. They confront uncomfortable truths. This is necessary. Difficult history must be confronted, not hidden. The victims of Unit 731 suffered unimaginable horrors. The least we owe them is remembrance, acknowledgement, and commitment to preventing such atrocities in the future. The secret Japan tried to erase couldn't stay buried forever. Truth emerged. Justice, though incomplete, was served in the court of history, and those who suffered are remembered. End. Dakar's educational resources, museums, and memorials. Museum of Evidence of War Crimes by Japanese Army Unit 731, Harbin, China. Documentation centers in Japan. Holocaust and war crimes museums worldwide include Unit 731 in context of medical ethics violations. Books. Factories of Death by Sheldon H. Harris, Comprehensive History, A Plague Upon Humanity by Daniel Barenblatt, Detailed Investigation. Unit 731 Testimony by Hal Gold, Survivor Accounts. Academic Resources. Medical Ethics Courses examining Unit 731 as case study. International Law courses covering war crimes prosecution. Historical studies on biological warfare history. Why this history matters. Understanding how medical ethics can be corrupted. Learning about war crimes accountability. Examining moral compromises in national security. Honoring victims by remembering their suffering. preventing future atrocities through education. This story was told with dignity and respect for victims. The focus was on justice, accountability, and historical truth, not on graphic details of suffering. This history matters. If you believe in justice and truth, subscribe for more important historical stories, hit like, and share to educate others. Comment: how should we balance national security and moral accountability? Turn on notifications for more significant history.